Welcome back to What I Learned Ghostwriting a Memoir in 1 Year. This is part 3, where, as promised, we'll talk about some logistical things like payment plans, overall costs, contracts, and scheduling. So let's get into it. First things first, I know it can be really uncomfortable to talk about pay, but you have to face it and you have to talk about it as early as you can in the process. You really do want to determine an agreed upon cost before getting too deep in the process. Now, that's not to say you have to come to the first meeting with, everything ironed out and getting either a yes or a no from your client. Instead, especially if you're just starting out, I would create some guidelines for yourself. So, hey client, why don't we work on a potential outline, spend an hour together and see what it's like working together. That'll be at no cost to you, and then we can talk about next steps. Doing something like that does a few things. One, it shows them that you're not just in it for the money, which you shouldn't be if you're taking on something as personal as ghostwriting a memoir. And 2, it develops trust between you and your client. 3, it also shows if there's just good synergy between you and your client, which helps your client decide, but it also helps you determine, do I actually want to work with this person on such a labor-intensive project? Now, I didn't actually ever create a written contract with my client. We were personal friends and I trusted him when it came to paying me, and he trusted me to get the work done. But in all honesty, I should have. A great business lesson that I learned from another business leader is that the role of the contract isn't just to get 2 signatures on a piece of paper. In fact, most of the time, something like that isn't even necessarily legally binding. The real goal of a contract is to communicate exactly what I'm offering and what I'm expecting from my client. That way, there are just no surprises. You can get as specific as you want. This number of words, this many hours per week, this payment plan. And in doing that, you'll be able to basically give yourself insurance that you're getting what you need out of the deal and that your client's getting what they need. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can try to break out the cost for a project like this. The main piece of advice that I learned was that ghostwriting a memoir or ghostwriting any kind of long-form content takes a lot more effort and a lot more time than you might anticipate at the beginning. So you want to ask for a sum of money that will actually capture the amount of work that goes into it. This book took me a year, okay? So it's challenging to figure out how to charge for something like that on day one. And it can be intimidating to put out a large sum of money in front of your client on day one, but you have to understand all the work that's going to go into it throughout the course of a year or whatever your schedule is. So I came to my client with a proposal and we talked it through. He told me what his budget was, and we ultimately came to a compromise that honestly was beyond my wildest dreams. It still kind of confuses me that someone paid me to do a project I cared so much about, but here we are. Another best practice that I'll share is to just over-communicate almost to the extreme. In almost every email correspondence I had with my client, I would remind them, okay, you've already covered invoices 1 to 3 on this date, and this date. Here I'm sending you invoice 4 for this amount due on this date. And in the coming weeks, you'll receive invoices 5, 6, and 7 amounting to a total amount of X dollars. That way, while there was no contract, it was kind of this written documentation of what was expected and what was still to come. Outside of the contract work and figuring out the money, there was still some behind the scenes work that I needed to do. I needed to make a business number. So I'm in Canada, and in Ontario at least, there's a few options for how to do this. Sole proprietorship, LLC. I didn't know what I needed to do or why, and with the help of an accountant friend of mine, shout out to Junaid, thank you, he advised that I open up a sole proprietorship. Now, the one thing I'll say about a sole proprietorship is that you only need to charge GST or HST if you expect to earn over 30,000 Canadian dollars in 1 calendar year. I can go into more detail about that if there's interest, but I'll leave it at that for now. So that briefly covers some of the more logistical elements. The last thing I want to say in this episode is you have to remember that your client hired you to be the creative one, And the way I set it up was I'd write a chapter or a bit of a chapter and I'd send it to him and ask for notes before proceeding. The only notes I ever got from my client were, misspelled names or incorrect song lyrics, whatever it was. They were rarely ever creative notes like, oh, I don't like the way that you phrased that, or actually I would have said something like this. And that goes back to what I'm saying in that your client is not a writer. Now, the fact that I got no creative notes does not mean that I'm an outstanding writer who has no room for improvements. What it means is that it's my responsibility to find editors who can give me that critical input in a way that my client could not. So I'll leave it at that, and next time we'll talk about a really big topic in the writing world, which is a query letter.